And so the government stepped in and took over AIG. The government now owns AIG. The government is the largest owner of the largest insurer. It owns 80% of the shares of AIG. There is no AIG. The insurance, and because AIG is such a monster in the field, and because the other major players are likewise indebted, the government basically now runs insurance and banking. No banking, no insurance decision of any importance can be made outside of the government. The collapse of the credit system resulted in the government doing the following. It socialized debt. We have had socialism. It's not that Mr. Obama may bring socialism, as Rush Limbaugh urges us to think about. It's that Bush already did it. It was Bush who initiated these steps because it happened under his government. Bush and Obama continues it. There's really not much difference. They went in and they rescued. And what they did is they absorbed the unsustainable, unsupportable private debts that were created by the private economy, which collapsed. And they substituted government debt. That is, the United States government went on a borrowing binge. It's still engaged in that. We will have the greatest deficit we've ever had in peacetime this year, next year. The government is borrowing massive amounts of money in order to rescue the private sector by transforming its private debts into state debt. That's the socialization of credit. But keep in mind, the government that did that has not found a social, let alone socialized, let alone socialist solution for all those unemployed people, or for all those homeless people, or for all those decimated people needing state support and state services. Hasn't done that. Even by comparison with American history, it's bizarre. In the Great Depression, when Franklin Roosevelt watched the unemployment go crazy between 1929, when the Depression started, and 1933, when the unemployment peaked, unemployment in the United States was 1 million, a little over 1 million people in 1929. In 1933, it was over 12 million people. Try to keep that perspective in mind. Franklin Roosevelt said, we can't have this. He went on the radio, no television then, he went on the radio and he said to the American people, if the private sector of our economy cannot provide the jobs our people need, then the government will have to do it. And he did it. The government began hiring millions of Americans. You should ask yourself, what is happening in a country today which sees an unemployment go from 7 million to 15 million or more if you use U6, that not only hasn't begun a government jobs program, but there's not even any kind of serious discussion about a government. Here and there, a congressman or woman says something, but there's nothing is happening. The President of the United States doesn't say a word. It's as if that policy was unknown, but it's a part of American history. Many of you have gone to the West and seen the national parks of the United States and been very pleased. Many of them were built by government workers during the 1930s, one of the things that was done. Here's another creative idea. Roosevelt hired artists, something called the WPA. They hired painters, sculptors, actresses and actors and writers and all kinds of artists. And they got them into troops, and then the government sent them all over the United States. Here was the idea. We're going to give these people jobs, and we're going to bring culture otherwise unavailable to all parts of the United States that had never had an opera in town or something. And you know, the United States was treated for several years to a dispersion of culture it had never had before, and it has never had since. And that was one result of a government program. And think to yourself, if the government hires, not only do you give people a job, which they want, and the sense of themselves that comes with having a job that you earn a decent income with, but people with government jobs would be able to meet their mortgage payments. And so it's a double-edged whammy. It helps you deal with your foreclosure problem. And people on government salary pay taxes, so the receipts of the states are not going to be as damaged, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this crisis continues, and the obtuseness of the society led by the business community is reflected not only in having done nothing for the mass of people that are suffering that I've talked about, and not only having skewed all help so far to the credit sector, but the same people who are telling you we have a recovery, literally to the person, are the same people who told you in 2003, 4, 5, and 6 that we were in an economy that was in great shape. They were the same people who in the early months of this crisis echoed the statements of then President Bush that we'd be out of this soon, that we're fundamentally a secure and in good shape economy, et cetera, et cetera. So take a long, large grain of salt with all of this discourse about recovery. Last thing, just as a supplement to the film. I didn't make this film, that is, I give the lecture and I worked with it, but this is a private company that makes documentary films. If you're not familiar with them, you actually might be, because they're all left of center politically. It's called the Media Education Foundation. You saw their name. MediaEd.org is how you find them on the website. And they produce a lot of films. So they made decisions that were not always would have been my decisions about what to cut and what not to use. Just like Michael Moore, who also took footage of me, made the decision to use and not use the parts that he did of the work I've done. I would have spent more time than this film did toward the end fleshing out this alternative. So I just wanted to say one thing about it. If workers were their own boards of directors, and there are many names for such an arrangement, some of you know that throughout American history there have been many enterprises. This is not some utopian dream of some distant future. This is an attempt to use something we've actually had in our country for centuries, but instead of making it a marginal form of business, make it the major one. Some of the names it's had are co-ops, worker co-ops or producer co-ops. It's when the workers cooperatively run their own business. And I would have liked to stress that two things about that you might want to think about. One, from my own experience as a university professor all my life, at the beginning of every semester I hand out little pieces of paper to my students and I ask them to tell me what they're majoring in, what jobs they've held, and then I always ask also a question, because it's just a way for me to know who I'm lecturing to. I ask them, what would you hope to be your economic situation 5 years after you graduate? So you have an idea what they're hoping for. And usually about 2/3 or more say something like this: I want to be my own boss. I've always found that very interesting, because in point of fact, a tiny number of them will ever be in that situation. But they hold on to it as a goal, as a hope, as a dream. And it means that they're going to have some trouble later on as that becomes unrealizable. However, imagine what might happen in a country like ours if we began to really offer people the opportunity to get closer to that than anything else they can get to, which would be in a worker-owned, worker-operated enterprise, because there at least you have some claim to be doing that, whereas the jobs you're going to otherwise get, you have none. And the other thing I would say about that is that the reason Americans particularly hesitate to think about a drastic change in the organization of enterprise, to see a non-capitalist way of organizing enterprise as a realizable goal to be struggled for, really has to do with ideas that are fixed in our minds, but that oughtn't to be and really don't need to be. And the best way I can get that across is to tell a parable.